everyone, and welcome to our lecture on research questions in political science. This one is going to be super important in developing your major paper for the semester, so let's jump in. So for this lecture, we're obviously going to be talking about the two kinds of research questions that I will allow for the assignment. They either need to be what effect or why questions, and we'll jump into those a little bit more. And then I'll show you some examples of research questions by subfield, and this is meant to be a little bit of an introduction into the subfields of political science. Now, the research questions for your paper, every Paul's research paper will require some kind of research question, at least in this major, okay? You don't just need a topic. You can't be like, I want to do it on voter ID laws. That's too broad. That's too vague. Your paper is going to be insane if you have that as a topic, okay? It would be way too broad. Instead, you need a question, and that will help narrow it down and feel way more manageable as a project, okay? Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, there are really two types of research questions that I will accept, okay? So the ultimate idea, though, is that they explain some kind of variation in the dependent variable. Now, the first kind of question is a why question. So why is there variation in this dependent variable? So for instance, why do some countries go to war and others don't? Why has democracy eroded around the world? Why do some people vote for a Democratic candidate and others don't? Right? Those are all examples of like variation in that dependent variable, the thing being affected. Now, the difference between a why question and a what effect question is that the what effect question also includes the independent variable. So it's asking what effect does this independent variable have on the variation of this dependent variable? So for instance, what effect does income have on vote choice in 2012? Okay, so in that case, the independent variable is income and vote choice is the dependent variable. It's being affected. Okay, what effect does income inequality have on the likelihood of civil war? In that case, the dependent variable, the thing being affected, is civil war, and income inequality is the independent variable. Now, you might wonder, like, well, how will I know which one to choose? My advice typically is to go more for the what effect question. That's only because what effect questions are actually a little narrower, making them easier to do for the literature review. That's just my general advice. But let's jump into some examples real quick. So here's some examples of why questions. Why are home prices higher in some places, right? The dependent variable there is home prices. Why are so many legislators lawyers? The dependent variable is the number or percentage of legislators who are lawyers. Okay, that's the dependent variable. The answer, by the way, to that question is that it's money, because being a lawyer opens you up to social and professional networks that you're better able to fundraise with. Okay, why do some countries have more corruption, right? And so there, the dependent variable is the level of corruption in a country. Okay, there are a variety of ways you could answer these questions, right? But this is an example of a why question. And you can see how it's a little broader, right? Why are home prices higher in some places? There are a variety of reasons that home prices are higher in some places compared to others, right? They are maybe they have trouble accessing certain like timber or wood or labor, but maybe it's also zoning laws. Maybe it is whether the city has an urban growth boundary or not. My point is here about why questions is it's perfectly fine to have a why question, but the number of explanations for it is quite large, and therefore it becomes difficult to do a literature review. Okay, that's why I tend to recommend what effect questions, but again, you can definitely do a why question. So an example of a what effect question would be, what effect does election timing, the independent variable, have on housing supply? There's some evidence to suggest that having elections timed in off-cycle years, odd-numbered years, so 2025, 2023, 2021, right? Years where there's not a presidential or a midterm election leads to lower housing supply. And that's because the people who are likely to turn out for those odd numbered year elections are typically wealthier, whiter homeowners. And homeowners especially have unique preferences compared to like renters and others. And they typically prefer to not build more housing. So like that's just a thing. Okay. What effect does being a lawyer have on fundraising ability? So there, the independent variable is being a lawyer, right? And the dependent variable is fundraising ability. And then finally, what effect does democracy have on the probability of a country experiencing civil wars? So democracy there is your independent variable, the thing that will be affecting your dependent variable, civil war or not. Okay. Now, the reason that, again, that I sort of lean towards the what effect questions is they help narrow down your literature review to things that are more relevant. Okay. Now, the other kind of thing you need to consider for your research question is whether it is a cross-sectional or a time series question. So cross-sectional questions focus on the dependent variable varying across space, okay? So that can mean across countries, it can mean across states, can mean across continents, it can mean across cities, it can mean across counties. It could even mean like all students at the university in 2025, right? But time series questions just look at one unit and they look at how that changes over time. So for instance, you would look at the University of Idaho and what enrollment looks like going from 2010 to 2025. Or maybe you look at what happens to the American economy from 2000 to 2025, right? That's time series. You're looking at something that varied across time. But again, I'm just choosing one unit, right? The United States or the University of Idaho, and I'm looking at how it changes over time, okay? So the example here, cross-sectional, what effect do voter ID laws have on state level turnout, right? That's looking at all 50 states, okay? That's looking at all 50 states at one point in time, okay? By contrast, like the counterexample here, a time series version of a really similar question is, what effect did Texas's voter ID laws have on turnout between 2008 and 2020, right? That's looking at one state, Texas, not all 50, just one, and it's looking across 12 years, right? From 2008 to 2020. Now, this leads to two approaches, right? So the first approach is find variation across space. So in order to have a good research question, there needs to be some kind of variation. For instance, I couldn't choose like a research question that was like, why did the people in my online Pals 235 class, why did they take this class? Or like what motivated them to do it? That's not quite right because you all selected into the class. Do you know what I mean? They all selected in, therefore there's no variation, right? There's nobody who didn't get into the class. There's no variation in that dependent variable. In any case though, this first approach, find variation across space, why does y, my dependent variable, vary across and then space, country, state, political leader, political institution at one point in time. So this means 5 things. You need to have a dependent variable that you are interested in, right? You focus on one point in time, but multiple units. Okay, so in the example of 50 states in 2020. And then you're trying to explain the variation across states or space. Why did all of those 50 states vary in some capacity? Again, y is your dependent variable. And if your dependent variable captures variation across space, you are dealing with a cross-sectional research question. Now, here is approach one, explain variation across space, okay? So this is the Gini index by state. Darker states are more unequal in terms of income compared to lighter states, and then Utah and Alaska. So maybe a good research question here would be, why does income inequality vary across states? And you can actually see a few things going on, right? First, there seems to be greater income inequality where there are sort of larger cities, right? Particularly along the East Coast and California. But then also there's more income inequality in the South. So maybe there are a couple of explanations here, right? Maybe there's something about like urban areas driving income inequality. I will say like urban spaces are really known to have high levels of income inequality. But maybe in the South, it might be some like extreme poverty that exists there, or some kind of like demographic bifurcations that potentially drive this. In any case, though, you were looking at how income inequality varies across the 50 states. Okay. Approach 2, find variation over time. So why does your dependent variable y vary over time in a given country, state, political leader, political institution? And there you just need to find a dependent variable that you're interested in, right? You are focusing on one country, state, or institution, and you're looking at it across time, across a time period. It could be 1 month, it could be 1 year, it could be 20 years, it could be 100 years, right? And you're trying to explain why it went from maybe having something to not having something, or increasing from a little or a lot, or decreasing too, right? Again, y is your dependent variable, and there must be some kind of variation in it. Now, if your dependent variable has some variation over time, you are dealing with a time series research question, okay? Now, here is an example. Why did the United States' level of democracy decrease since 2009? So what you're looking at here is the Freedom House score from 2009 to 2024. I should note super quick, we do not have 2025's numbers yet. Those come out at the beginning of 2026. So this is just through 2024, and you can see from 2009 to 2024, they have gone down. It's partially attributable. There are a few guesses, Citizens United being one of them, and Shelby County v. Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act, are probably contributing factors, and they both occurred in the late aughts or early 2010s. Okay. Now, I want you to be aware of this, but we're not going to do it in this class. There's also something called a time series cross-sectional research question, okay? We are not doing that in this class, just an FYI, okay? That's because the methods to deal with it are complex, okay? But, and by that I mean in statistical analyses and even in case studies, but particularly statistical analyses, you are always assuming that observations are independent from one another, and a time series cross-sectional design means that units repeat over time. So to take the example of let's say we're looking at income inequality in the states, I would have all 50 states from 2000 to 2020. And that means that Alabama in 2000 exists in my data, as well as Alabama in 2001 and 2002 and 2003. But the thing is Alabama in 2001 is not a different state entirely than Alabama in 2002. It's not like we roll over to Alabama in 2002 and we're like, now it's a new state, right? And in the data set, you can't treat them as such. My point here is the way that you would handle this is pretty complex, and you are not going to learn about that in this class, but I do want you to know that it exists, and you should be aware of it, okay? Now, the other thing that I want you to be informed about is that research questions can be phrased in broad or narrow ways. So this is a broad version of a research question. Why did the United States' level of democracy decrease over the past 20 years? Okay. It's a whole country. Okay. A narrow version is, why has Wisconsin experienced democratic backsliding over the past 20 years? Okay. These are very similar questions, but one is looking quite broadly, and then another is much more narrower, just on Wisconsin. Either way, though, your paper will still be set up the same. Okay. Either way, your paper will be set up the same. Now, I do want to provide you a little bit of warning. Baglioni has example research questions, but not all of them are why questions. But for the assignment here, you only should be doing why or what effect questions. Okay. In any case, though, what you should be looking for is a puzzle. Okay, so that means that there is variation on your dependent variable that seems surprising, particularly cross-sectional questions. Okay, so why was Algeria relatively calm during the Arab Spring while Egypt was not? And you know how in week 1, I asked you all, tell me why you like this major, tell me what kind of news you read, tell me your interests, right? I know that you all read news, right? Chances are there are very few political science majors who simply don't read the news, okay? But you likely have in your news feed, you come across stories and maybe something seems surprising to you sometimes, okay? That's a puzzle, right? That's a puzzle. See if you can cultivate a research question out of that. That week 1 activity, that discussion board was not just meant for you to introduce yourselves to me. It's also to get you started on thinking about what you like, what you're interested in, and how we can maybe make that a research topic. Okay. Now, the next thing that I want to jump into is the subfields. So there are 3 subfields, and we're going to do American politics first. The first this is the field that I work in, and it is typically American national institutions, and that means Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. Political behavior, that is how people vote, how people engage civically, how people engage in democracy, democratic attitudes. Think polling, think public opinion polling, and the behavior of voters and residents in the United States. That's the best way to think about it. And then there's also subnational politics, which just means state and local government. Now, some example research questions. Why are there so many lawyers in Congress? These would be from American politics. For national institutions specifically, what effect does partisanship have on presidential visits? And then why did the Supreme Court reach a specific decision on a certain case? Okay, these are all reasonable questions to be asking. I'm not saying that you should ask them, right? But I do want to give you some sense of what the research questions look like across the subfields. Now, for political behavior, some example research questions in American politics is, why did some people vote for Donald Trump in the 2024 election and others didn't? Okay. That's a perfectly fine one, and I believe the data is released now for the 2024 election through ANES. Another one would be, what effect does income have on vote choice? These are all fairly straightforward. And here's a really broad one, but is really important. Why has the electorate become more polarized over time? These are all about people's political behaviors, their attitudes, how did they vote for something, their ideology, that kind of thing. And these are completely appropriate. And if this is maybe in the vein of something you're interested in, this would be a completely appropriate topic. Subnational politics. Why do some states have lower inequality than others, right? We've already talked about that one. Why do some states have better educational outcomes than others? There is a good strand of scholarship that says it's the funding, but there are also a lot of other factors that matter in whether a state has good educational outcomes or not. Okay. And then maybe you have something really specific. a lot of you in the discussion boards were saying things like I'm interested in like local and state politics. Like here's one that's like very narrow and applied to just cities. What effect does a mayor's partisanship have on a city's credit ratings, right? Like that is not a super like hot or controversial topic, but is super important. And then there's finally, what effect do unions have on income inequality? And there's a really great scholar who did work on like what effect unions have on income inequality and found that over time they tend to lower income inequality in a state, right? But again, that's looking at 50 states over time and seeing how unions affect that. You don't have to do any of these questions, but I'm just sort of showing you like these are some that exist out there. So international relations is our second field in political science. This is typically the political dynamics between countries. So think about war or peace or conflict, or they are between countries and international institutions. So think Germany and the EU, right? Or the United States and the World Health Organization, that kind of thing, okay? So this typically gets divided into 3 subfields. This is not my field, by the way. If you are interested in international relations, then you should talk to Dr. Justvan, Dr. Wong, or Dr. Damon. And there's also Charles Danoff, Dr. Danoff in the department. And there is international law and organization. There's a class offered on that. There's international security. And then there's international political economy. And we have quite a good number of political scientists at U of I who study IR. Now, if we were to talk about research questions on international organizations, why do states sometimes leave international institutions? So this is a very common one right now. Think about the United States, like trying to like potentially leave the World Health Organization. Or maybe we have a what effect question, like what effect does immigration have on the departure from international institutions? Like obviously for the UK, immigration played a great role in leaving the EU. And then maybe you also have a question, why do states sometimes submit their disputes to international courts for adjudication? So there are a ton of different ways that you can take this, but this is primarily about how states relate to one another and how states relate to international organizations. Okay. These are like the really hot button ones that we see a lot of students do papers on over the years. So international security, why do some states build nuclear weapons? Or what effect does GDP have on states providing troops to UN peacekeeping missions? Or why do some states settle their border disputes and others are unable to do so, right? These are all totally appropriate for the project. And if you're interested in something like these, you're perfectly welcome to do them. Okay. And then there's IPE or international political economy. And here are some research questions for those. Why do some countries provide more foreign aid than others? Right. And then why do some countries receive more foreign aid from the US than others? Right. It's not totally based off of need. There are a lot of other factors that go into it. But IPE is the third subfield here under IR. Okay, now the final field that we're going to talk about is comparative politics as a field. So this is typically political dynamics within other countries that are not the US. Okay, so that can be comparative development, comparative institutions, and comparative behavior. Right now, no one at the University of Idaho's Department of Politics and Philosophy does comparative politics, but I do want you to know it exists, and if you choose a topic on it, like we were all trained on it in grad school and are happy to help you. It's just not what our current research agenda is on. So comparative development, what effect does political polarization have on democratic erosion? Or maybe why did Hungary or other countries backslide into authoritarianism? If anything, though, you should think about comparative development. It's partially economic, but it's also mostly about democratic development. Okay, comparative institutions. Why do some countries make voting compulsory, but others don't? Or maybe what effect does demographic homogeneity have on welfare generosity, right? It's like you're looking at the institutions, like remember how we talked about In the United States, those institutions were the Senate, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. Here, you're looking more at like electoral rules or policy rules, that kind of thing. Comparative behavior. Why do some countries have significantly higher turnout rates than others? Why are some revolutions successful while others are not? That kind of thing. Okay, so there are a ton of different options. I know I've walked you through a lot of them. I'm sorry, but I want to give you a sense that you have a lot to think about, and maybe you're like, I'm actually really overwhelmed, but this is really about what your interests are. Think about and reflect on what some of those questions were on that introduction discussion board. What are some things that you're interested in? What news stories do you stop on and like read more closely? See if you can find some themes, and we can help you cultivate a research question on that so that you are working on a project that caters to your interests throughout the semester. Because there are going to be times that you won't like this project. I'm just going to be upfront with you. You will not enjoy it. But at least you have chosen something that is interesting to you, right? And you'll learn more about this topic. And like the final caveat here is I'm flexible on topics. It doesn't need to be a pure political science topic. Like all of those things that I just said about like these are the subfields and these are example questions. If we can just get you something even adjacent to political science, or if it's more criminal justice, that kind of thing, it just has to fall within the scientific method, okay? That's just like the one thing. Now, if you have any questions, let me know, but next up, you should watch the associated documentary and start thinking about some research questions.